Hello, everyone. We are back. I got you there, didn't I? We are back with another archetype discussion. AP, do you have any idea what number this is?
Go away.
It's something around 16,
17?
17. I'll figure it out. Whatever it is.
16.
16. That's what I thought. 16. See? Okay. Anyway, we are back for another archetype discussion. And this time, AP and I are going to be talking about the Callow Youth, which is a pattern. If that phrase doesn't ring any bells, you're going to recognize what we're talking about shortly, because it is a pattern that is very common, goes all the way back to ancient myths and legends, but it is something that you see very prominently in fantasy. And there is, I think, a psychological purpose behind this archetype, this pattern that you see of a youth who is usually comes from a very parochial part of the world where people don't know a lot about the outside, and there's a lot of ignorance, a lot of naivete, and the youth is thrust out of this pastoral existence into a big bad world where lots of things happen. And this also can bring in a kind of travel narrative as well, which is a pattern you often see associated with the Callow Youth, which is going out into the world and seeing different places and things, and that in the course of that, transforming the youth. So this might sound familiar to people who know the hero's journey and that sort of thing. So it's a very, very, very important pattern in fantasy. Fair to say, AP?
Yeah, and as you said, there's a psychological aspect to it.
Yeah.
There's a narratological aspect to it.
Yeah.
And you can see the interlinking between the two. But before we get started on this, the point that I wanted to make is, again, when we talk about a lot of these sorts of archetypes and tropes,
yeah,
so often people go, oh, it's this trope. It's how the trope is being used, why it is being used, how it is deployed, how it is integrated. That is usually far and away more important than the superficial elements that are present.
right.
That you can identify it, that's the first step. You have to take the next step. That's the really important part, because the Callow Youth, we can look at this, and in terms of let's talk about the psychological aspect.
Yeah.
So if you have a character who knows nothing about this world, that they're about to go on this grand adventure, who else knows nothing about the world and is about to go on a grand adventure? The reader. So immediately the author is using a technique, creating a character as a protagonist in the novel that is going to link to the reader's knowledge and understanding of the world, create that psychological link, create that point of connection between the reader and the character, and it creates a level of investment in the journey straight away from the very beginning. That is, and it is such a powerful technique. So you can go, oh yeah, it's the blonde-haired, blue-eyed farm boy going on a quest. Oh, that's so cliched. Right. First of all, actually, blonde-haired, blue-eyed farm boys are not quite as common as people seem to think they are in fantasy.
Yeah.
Do a survey of a couple of hundred fantasy novels. You don't have that many blonde-haired, blue-eyed farm boys going on quests. I can assure you. But you can see why this construction, this narrative technique, this trope or archetype is so popular with authors. It is a fabulously versatile and powerful tool.
And we know this because it goes way back. We could talk about, from ancient Greek myth, Theseus and Perseus, for example. You could talk about Sigurd, the dragon slayer in Norse mythology. You could talk about the various Grail legends and the Arthurian mythology, or Sir Gawain and the Green Knight is a great example of the Callow Youth going out and learning a bit about the way life works and coming back with a sharp lesson, but a bit more wise for the experience. So there are lots of these stories that go way, way back. And one of the first fantasy writers, although the word fantasy wasn't around then, but we would recognize it as fantasy, who uses this pattern to me is William Morris does it in a lot of his prose romances from the 1890s. The Well at the World's End being a great example of this young person who has to go. Most of them were male in his stories, but he does have a couple of females. There's a bird alone in the water of the Wondrous Isles. So he has these young people going out and encountering the world, and they are very naive at first, and they get some life lessons, and they learn about egalitarianism versus hierarchy usually, and that's a William Morris thing. So yeah, a very familiar pattern going way back, and that fantasy writers can plug into, and I think if used skillfully can be very compelling narratives.
Yeah, and this ties in then to the narratological or narrative reason why you do it, because if a character knows nothing about the world or knows very little about the world, they are going to find out about it. They're going to get informed. So there's your structure for having your entire narrative. They go on a quest, they go on a journey, and as things are explained to them, as they learn about it, you can explain it to the reader. And so the reader progresses and learns on the same journey. So not only are you connecting the reader to the character, but you have a built-in, now I can tell you all about this world that has been living in my head, and I wanted to get down on the page so that you can see it. And it doesn't feel as forced as, say, a character going and going, oh, we're traveling to there. Well, that is this place, and let me take down this book, and so was king, and this huge exposition. What you can actually then do is have a character explore it, and the reader learn with them. So it's a built-in narrative function for the telling of the world. And that's one of the reasons why it's so popular, and it's why a lot of the Callow Youth stories, which I need to unpack that actually just for a sec, are linked to travel logs.
Right.
These are two sort of linked aspects. When we talk about the Callow Youth, they don't necessarily have to be a youth. We're talking, that's just a general term for this concept. Right. Because typically it is a younger character to reflect ignorance and naivety and lack of learning and knowledge of the world. But someone like Odysseus on his journey, on his Odyssey. Oh, I wonder how those two things got linked, Odysseus and Odyssey. But he doesn't know about the various places he visits. You have that travelogue element where you're exploring the same thing through his eyes. He doesn't know about them, he learns about them. He has adventures and misadventures along the way. That's how we learn about the world. Even though technically he is not a youth, and he's not even callow, because he's a king, he's educated, he's intelligent, he has a lot of experience. But you can see it's the same technique that is being deployed, because the areas in which he is going, the areas he visits, are ones that he does not know about. So it's employing exactly the same technique.
Well, speaking of characters who are not quite youths, but nevertheless fit this pattern very nicely, although they're both little, we could talk about Bilbo in The Hobbit and Frodo in Lord of the Rings, who actually follow pretty similar patterns. Bilbo being, I think, the more classic example of if he were just young, he would be a Callow Youth, but he's a middle-aged hobbit. But he's little, so, he's kind of a kid in a way. But that naivete, leaving the womb of the Shire and going out into the big world and discovering all the wildness of it and the beauty of it and being transformed by the experience. There it is.
And with The Hobbit, obviously, the Hobbit is very much staying with Bilbo as the point of view. He's the through line through everything. We explore the world through his portal quest, leaving one area, basically going through a portal, even though in this case it's more metaphysical in that he travels outside of the Shire. John Clute refers to stuff like that as a polder from the Dutch, the idea of an enclosed space. But because he leaves the Shire, it's basically the Shire is normality. He leaves the Shire, so we can call it a portal,
right? And
then goes on a quest. And whether it's a physical portal, like walking through the wardrobe in the Chronicles of Narnia, a portal into a new world, it's metaphorical in The Hobbit. But you see, it's the same technique time and time again of younger characters who don't know about the world. The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, perfect example.
Perfect example.
They journey into this fantastical realm. With Bilbo, it's going out into a more perilous realm. So you know, you can deploy it in different ways to explore the perilous or to explore the fantastic.
Right.
But that's what we have going into the wider world. And one of the reasons this is so popular in children's fiction and in YA, it's used a lot in both of those. If think of the psychological aspect of that, the transition from childhood to adulthood, the transition from ignorance and lack of knowledge to being wise and gaining knowledge and experience. That transition is modeled in the physical journey. So it is a literalization of growing up.
Yeah. So there are rites of passage that the character goes through. Bilbo acquires a sword and names it when he kills a beastie, a spider, right? He names it Sting, you know. So this is a rite of passage of a sort, naming his sword and all of that. So we don't have to get too Freudian about that.
But I was going to say, like, let's not talk about how the young male hero is polishing his weapon in the dark.
Right. Exactly.
And naming it.
Exactly. Yeah. So it doesn't have to be just exploring the world. It could be exploring other worlds. For example, Luke Skywalker in Star Wars is a great example of the Callow Youth. In his case, he leaves his home planet and goes to other planets and is exposed to a bigger, wider universe or galaxy far, far away, I suppose. So.
But again, like, think even when going from planet to planet, what do we have in Star Wars? You go, there's the desert planet, there's the water planet, there's the ice planet. You go, they are these monoclimate, monogeographical sort of regions. It's the same as having the different lands on a map, the desert story, and then you transition from the desert to the jungle, and it's going through these polders, these set places that have these defined boundaries, and then you transition to the next one. You can talk about it in terms of contiguous and non-contiguous narrative spaces, but you get the general sense of it.
Yeah, it's great. So let's talk about some other great examples in modern fantasy then, because I think we have established sort of the ground of all of this.
Well, before we transition to that, the Bilbo as an example, and then contrasting it just temporarily with Frodo for a second.
Yeah, good. Yeah.
Because here we see the difference. Obviously, The Hobbit is a children's story. Even though for the modern day, the language being used, it might have either aged up or aged down depending on culture. But it was written very much as a children's story. Singular focus, singular character, and that strong identification. The Lord of the Rings starts that way. Yeah. And we have that. But one of the big differences, obviously, with The Lord of the Rings is, and spoilers for The Lord of the Rings, the fellowship splits apart. And it's not just that there's a lot more darkness and seriousness to some of the themes and events in The Lord of the Rings, because some parts of The Hobbit are quite scary, particularly for young children or anyone who has arachnophobia.
Right.
But it's not just about that. It's about the narrative structure. And the narrative structure in The Lord of the Rings is much more mature. It's much more adult. It's not dependent on that you must identify with, and I'm going to literalize this journey and explain these things. It takes the world as being known and is more immersive. And it's actually a different style of fantasy. An immersive fantasy assumes reader knowledge. And once Frodo is out of the Shire and begun the quest, by the time you get to the Two Towers and Return of the King, even though they're still exploring new places with Frodo's thread, there's more of an assumption of knowledge of the world, and the world itself becomes much more immersive as a result.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, there's a big tonal difference there. And it's interesting because Tolkien was supposed to write a sequel to The Hobbit, and it starts out that way, but he clearly wanted to go somewhere else. And he was kind of dragged, I think, in that direction by his earlier mythology that was later published as the Silmarillion and all that stuff. So, but that's fantastic stuff. But to take a slightly more modern example, you could look at Feist's The Magician, for example, with Pug being a good example of the Callow Youth.
But not only Pug as the Callow Youth, exploring the magic storyline,
Right.
Thomas as the Callow Youth,
Yeah.
exploring the martial storyline,
Yeah.
and Arutha as the Callow Youth, exploring the political storyline. So
Yeah.
you have the three different threads being interwoven to do the three different sort of narrative quests, if you like.
Yeah.
And we see again a variant of this in Feist and Wirtz's Empire trilogy,
Right.
where Mara of the Akoma, she is about to take holy orders. She is an innocent, and yes, she's the daughter of a noble and has been raised and educated, but she's about to take holy orders. And although the quest elements are dramatically reduced in that series, a lot of it is she doesn't understand the political landscape, and a lot of it is bringing the reader along with her as she learns to find her footing and manipulate the political landscape around her to save her house. So it's not quite the same, but you can see the same techniques being employed. So she's not quite a Callow Youth,
right?
But she's a fascinating variant thereof.
Interesting. Yeah. A great author, one that we both admire very much, who has written lots of trilogies in the same world, the realm of the Elderlings. So Robin Hobbs' Farseer trilogy features a Callow Youth in Fitz, but also her Liveship Traders features Althea. So she gives us variants of the Callow Youth in these various trilogies, doesn't she?
And when you think of the Assassins trilogy, the first trilogy, the Farseer trilogy, sorry, right. There isn't while there are quest elements at certain points and travelogue elements at certain points, a lot of it is much more localized, but it's still about learning the world, learning the environments, the environs. It's the growth of Fitz as a character, whereas it's much more literal in Althea's
for Althea.
Storyline.
She navigates the world. Yeah.
So that's while we talk about this in terms of travelogue, it's understanding the principle underlying it rather than looking at it in terms of, but they didn't go very far. It's not about that. It's sometimes it's a literal physical journey. Other times it's more a growth, a journey of the spirit, the mind, knowledge, education, all of these things. That it's a more metaphorical journey that they go on. Yeah. But you can see elements of both.
Yeah, it's interesting. And I mean, everybody's talking about Wheel of Time right now, and I think even if you haven't read the books, you've only watched the first few episodes of the television series, you can see several examples of Callow Youths there as they leave the pastoral, Emmonsfield, or what I guess they just call it Two Rivers in the show. But anyway, they're being booted out of that into a bigger, scarier world and encountering things that are changing them. So all of them are in variants of a sort, I suppose, on this idea, aren't they?
And one of the aspects we haven't talked about is in a lot of these stories, quite often there is a mentor figure. And we talked about this in the Jungian archetypes, the idea of the sage or the wizard or the magus, someone who is educating and mentoring and teaching the hero. Because when you couple those two things, the central character who doesn't know, a guiding mentor figure who does know, you can have the physical journey as well as you have moments of explanation and exposition about the world are filtered into it as the hero misunderstands something and then has a teachable moment. So we can see elements of that, and we see it in obviously like the Lord of the Rings and in the Hobbit. And
Gandalf is the mentor to Bilbo and Frodo. You have Obi-Wan Kenobi to Luke Skywalker. Yeah, I mean, it's almost a given that there's going to be a mentor figure. So Moraine in the Wheel of Time obviously is the mentor figure for the young people from Two Rivers. Yeah.
But if we think of N.K. Jemisin's the fifth season and that
Broken
entire
Earth
trilogy, again, it's not that Jemisin has deployed this stereotypically. That character set, the way it has been done, again, think of it in terms of there's the home area and then a journey, a mysterious mentor figure at times, learning about the world so the reader can learn along with them. Jemisin does this so well, and playing with the narrative perspective to do so.
Oh yeah.
It's also like leaning into this and creating a brand new experience of something that, you know, when you read a lot of fantasy, you go, oh, but I know exactly what this travelogue is. And Jemison manages to make it seem incredibly fresh because she plays with the narrative perspective.
It's actually brilliantly done there. And it shows you what an author can do with this. Because as, for example, the character Cyanide learns more about the world and how it works, it gives the reader a perception of one of the big themes in here, which is the oppression and also the resilience of the characters who are resisting this oppression. So it gives you a deeper look into what's really going on. As people have this narrative, they pretend this is what's happening, but we're discovering truths beneath that surface narrative along with the character. And Jemison is able to brilliantly weave in these important themes in the process, themes about oppression. So I think it's really well done there, and it's a pattern that still pays off really nicely, as we can see when you look at what a skillful author like that can do with that. It's tremendous. I think Le Guin is another great example in her Earthsea books in general, but in the first one is the most well known, A Wizard of Earthsea, with Ged, getting to know the world outside of his little tiny island of Gaunt, right? And discovering some big truths that will have a big impact on his life and in the process. But even the later books, like Tehanu, Tehanu is another example. So,
and we see a similar sort of thing in obviously the Harry Potter books, where in the earlier books, although it's not a massive journey, you have that leaving the rail, going through the portal to the fantastical world, and we as reader learn along with Harry what is happening in the fantastical world, because he knows nothing about it. We learn with him as the others correct him, as he encounters these strange and wonderful things. Yeah. It's explained to him, because again, you have Dumbledore coming in, you have McGonagall, you even have other characters the same age going, how can you not know about this? But then in the later books, there is a literal quest. It's so, Rowling deploys it just the same as everyone else, and you can see why it creates such a psychological bond between reader and character, and why it is such a useful technique, because you can use it for they're just going to magic school, but they had to leave behind the mundane, enter the fantastic, and now it has to be explained to them. Yeah. Or they can go on a literal quest and journey to different places, and you have that, the typical fantasy quest story. Yeah. And it works the same way, one very, very literal and one much more sort of metaphorical.
Yeah, and your Harry Potter example also reminds me that not only is the mentor figure a necessary part of this pattern, but you also typically have the protagonist picking up side character friends, right? So there's a friend or a found family element to this often as well, as in Harry Potter, with Hermione and Ron and all of that. But in Ged also finds a very close friend when he goes to wizard school, right? So that's, you form on these quests. Usually there's a group that bonds as a result of these experiences, and that is also, I think, another important element of this journey, that the Callow Youth and these friends. They serve the purpose of backing up the Callow Youth, and as this person grows and changes, and as they encounter things and dangers out there in the world. But the youth learns about the importance of relationships and friendships in the process as well. So that's an important function as well, isn't it?
Yeah, and if you think of the narrative function, because you can understand the psychological function, you can understand it in terms of why it works to support a lot of the structures about learning from different people, learning different perspectives. Yeah. And that works into the story very, very neatly, and it ties into that theme of the coming of age narrative, or the journey and the intellectual growth. But in terms of just a simple narrative technique, one person going on a quest finds it very hard to have a conversation. Two people, on the other hand, can have a dialogue.
Yeah.
And suddenly you have more options as an author to tell your story, that you have two different voices that you can play with, and you can have them having a conversation. So even on a very simple level, this is one of the reasons why heroes quite often have sidekicks,
Yeah.
because otherwise, are they going to talk to themselves a lot?
It's true.
Or
Yeah.
if they have a sidekick, they can talk to the sidekick. And what we sometimes then find is, in those things, the sidekick becomes the ignorant one, or the one that doesn't know anything. And it's one of the differences between the sidekick and, say, a mentor figure, is that change of knowledge, where a hero can explain things to the sidekick. So in those circumstances, you can have the Callow Youth is actually the sidekick, and the hero, the protagonist, is on the quest, and they are looking after someone. So Batman and Robin would be sort of the classic way.
Yeah.
But you can also have Gandalf and Frodo. So the perspective is with the youth, the sidekick. Because let's face it, Frodo is Gandalf's sidekick. But you can see it's the same technique, but it's choosing narrative focus either on the one with knowledge or the one without knowledge. Yeah. But it's always working with a knowledge differential where one person has it and one person doesn't.
Yeah, yeah, and there are so many other great examples out there. One that I read last year is the Poppy War trilogy, which has Rin as its central protagonist, and it's very fair to say that she, in many ways, is a very nice, creative version of the Callow Youth, who goes to a similar kind of wizarding school of a sort, I guess, or a school where she learns about magic eventually, but there's that narrative in there, and then there's a friendship group, there's a mentor figure, nice variations on all of these things, actually. Or our series that we're reading, the Malazan Book of the Fallen, certainly has some Callow Youths in it, and Erikson, as you know, as usual, does something different with these patterns, because he's Erikson, but Crocus, for example, is an example of a Callow Youth of a sort, who doesn't do exactly what we expect. He doesn't become the Luke Skywalker of the story, but he starts out in a way we recognize him as the Callow Youth, right?
Yeah, but even in the very opening, Ganos Paran is being presented
very much so, yeah,
as the Callow Youth.
Yeah.
And see, this is the thing that obviously I always go on and on about. Things are more complicated than you think, and things are more interrelated than you think, because we've been talking about the Callow Youth, but we've brought in the mentor, we've brought in the sidekick, we've brought in travel logs and portal quests and immersive fantasy. We've talked about all these different things because this one aspect, you can see how it is connected to other things and how they interrelate, and that dynamic between these elements is where we get the meaning of the story created, and where we get originality being played with by an author. It's how they deploy them, and that, I think, is one of the fascinating things, because I love talking about archetypes, and I love talking about the tropes that get used. But the thing is, it's always remembering that these things don't exist as an island unto themselves.
In a vacuum, yeah.
They are part and parcel of that narrative weave. And if you ignore all of the threads that are running through in the different directions, connecting them to the other pieces, you don't get a general sense of why they are being used. And so this is why when we started talking about this, I said, it's not just about identifying the thing. It's not just about seeing those superficial elements. It's about understanding the placement of those elements into the narrative and how it is being deployed and utilized.
Yeah. I think that is a great thought for us to finish with. So I want to thank you, Dr. Canavan, for keeping me company and I just had a wonderful time talking with you about the Callow Youth and all of the other elements that we brought into this discussion. We probably could have brought in the Chosen One and other things as well, but that's how these things work. So, but thank you, AP. It was a lot of fun, and thank you everyone else for listening. AP, would you like to say goodbye to everybody too?
Well, firstly, thank you very much, Philip. I genuinely enjoy these conversations. This is a lot of fun, and it's one of my great joys about studying fantasy literature and talking about fantasy literature is to pick these things apart and see how they interrelate and see how they get changed over time. So thank you very much for this opportunity. And I am very sorry to your audience who has to listen to me witter on, but thank you, Philip.
Well, I don't think they're sorry, and I'm certainly not. So thank you very much. And until next time, everyone.